All right, good evening. We want to thank Community Board 11 for reaching out for this training and having us here tonight. I think it's important to keep open lines of communication, about how HPD finances affordable housing. This is a beautiful space. Thank you to El Museo del Barrio for hosting us here as well. My name is James Chikov. I'm Manhattan Planning in the Manhattan Borough team in the Division of Planning and Pre-Development at HPD. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Agata Maklitska, and I'm also a Manhattan Borough Planner.
Good evening. Oops, I'm not on. Oh, you're on real quick. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us out. My name is Melissa Ott. I am the Director of Manhattan Planning, and we're really pleased to be here tonight to provide this presentation. It will have quite a bit of information, so hang in there with us, and then we'll open the floor for questions after.
Okay, so there we go. So as I mentioned, we're looking forward to having a discussion about how HPD develops affordable housing and what that means for, Community Board 11, Community District 11. The presentation tonight is going to be about 40 minutes, so bear with us. We wanted to, make sure we can explain everything. It's a little bit dense information. For the agenda, we'll do a quick introduction, go into New York City's affordable housing crisis a little bit, and then provide an overview of new construction programs before moving over to talk about the basics of how financing works for affordable housing, and then, the Q&A section. So Agatha will kick us off, so I'll pass it over.
Thank you, James. All right. So as mentioned earlier, we work for New York City's housing agency, otherwise known as the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And HPD has 3 core mission goals, including ensuring housing quality. So in 2023, HPD conducted 739,000 inspections and issued 732,000 violations. HPD also works to preserve existing affordable housing and create new affordable housing. So since 2014, the agency has financed over 93,000 new affordable homes and preserved 155,000 existing affordable homes. The agency also works to engage New Yorkers to build and sustain neighborhood diversity through the form of neighborhood plans, such as the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan, education and outreach about housing resources and rights, and also community engagement for public sites. And so there are several community benefits of HPD finance development, including increased opportunities for access to affordable housing, particularly options that meet accessibility standards. In most new construction programs, 20% of units have a community district preference up until April 2026. And then after April 2026, 15% of units have a community district preference, meaning convenient board residents are prioritized for those units. HPD finance units are also rent stabilized, and they prioritize community needs, such as the vacant lots identified for redevelopment to the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan. And here we just have a snapshot of significant demographic and housing data in CD11. So the median household income for CD11 is $51,320. And around 25% of CD11 residents are foreign born. And as seen in the chart on the right, the demographic makeup is predominantly Hispanic at 46%, and then Black non-Hispanic at 27%. And out of an estimated 51,000 housing units, 92% of all units are renter occupied, 50% of all units are income restricted, and then 21% of rental units are rent stabilized. And as I'm sure many people know, New York City is in the midst of an affordable housing crisis, but we're going to discuss more in depth what that actually entails. So the housing problems in the city consist of, for one, housing costs are too high for most New Yorkers. Maintaining quality housing is expensive. There are not enough available homes, and there's also limited housing and neighborhood choice. So what do we mean when we say affordable housing? It's common for housing to be considered affordable when a household spends no more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities, and most government programs use this as a guideline. So for example, if your gross household income is $20,000, your rent and utilities should be no more than $500 to be considered affordable. Or for example, if your gross household income is $50,000, your rent and utilities should be no more than $1,250 to be considered affordable. However, many households pay much higher rents, and 48% of renters in Manhattan Community District 11 are paying more than 30% or more of their income towards rent, meaning they are rent burdened. And 21% of renters in Community District 11 are severely rent burdened, meaning they pay 50% of their income or more towards rent. And as you can see in the chart on the right, this is pretty consistent both across Manhattan and New York City overall. Here we have an example illustrating what severe rent burden looks like. So a 3-person family household seeking housing makes a gross income of around $51,300 a year, and then monthly their income is around $4,275. If they are looking to rent an average 2-bedroom apartment available in New York City, they would have to spend on rent around $2,750 a month. They would be spending around 65% of their monthly income on rent and leaving them only with $1,525 of remaining income for their other budget and necessary expenses. Maintaining quality housing is also expensive. The average cost to maintain an apartment in New York City can range from $810 to $1,450 per month. And rents are used to cover maintenance costs per unit. However, when rents can't cover maintenance costs, government subsidy may be needed to fill the gap, and this can prevent severe rent burden, homelessness, and unsafe housing. Across the city, there are also not enough available homes. So a housing emergency is considered when the citywide vacancy rate is under 5%, and New York City's current vacancy rate is around 1.4%. However, as seen on the chart on the screen, for a household making the median income of CB11M, that number is even much lower, and affordable units for that household that are available across the city are only at 0.9%. And lastly, new affordable housing construction is uneven. So of the over 93,000 new affordable homes constructed in New York City between 2014 and 2024, new affordable homes have been concentrated in specific areas as seen in the map on the map to the right, such as the South Bronx or East New York and Brownsville. Other areas of New York City have seen very little affordable housing, as seen in the light blue and almost white areas on the map, and this ultimately affects housing and neighborhood options for residents seeking affordable housing. And so what is HPD's role in addressing the housing crisis? So HPD works to preserve existing affordable housing through preservation loans, tax incentives, health and safety programs, and loans for home repairs. The agency also works to create new affordable housing through loans, tax incentives, and other public resources, which we'll discuss more in depth later in the presentation. Also increasing access to affordable housing through Housing Connect 2.0, helping residents access housing on Housing Connect through the Housing Ambassador Program, and improved eligibility requirements. And lastly, the agency also works to protect tenants and homeowners through tenant education and resources, eviction prevention, and rental assistance. And now I'll pass it to James to talk in more detail about how we actually finance new construction of affordable housing.
Okay. I'm going to keep this slides to the side. This feels a little awkward. I'm really official with this up here. Okay, thanks, Agatha. So the bulk of today's presentation will be about new construction programs. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Yeah, okay. New construction programs and the financing behind them. And this because these are the projects you're likely most familiar with, our team and other developers presenting to your board. So HPD finances affordable housing on both public and private property for both for-profit and nonprofit developers. So HPD transfer, and of some ways that we do that is HPD can transfer city-owned property to affordable housing developers through a competitive process like a request for proposals, or known as an RFP. And an example of that would be the first image here of the Beacon, which you're all familiar with, and has been filed and hopefully coming your way this fall. So that project was part of the East Harlem RFP, and that came out of the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan, and that's a public site. On the other hand, private property owners and developers can approach HPD for financing if they want to build affordable housing. So that's the second option, second example you have down here, 1998 Second Avenue. And then developers enter a regulatory agreement with the city, which is anywhere between 30 to 60-year terms. However, with public sites, it is usually a 60-year minimum term for affordable housing regulatory agreements. So HPD facilitates the development of housing through offering city-owned land when that's available, direct financing of the development, that is through subsidy loan programs, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's also tax breaks, and those are awarded and administered by HPD. And there is inclusionary housing, which is like MIH, and another one called voluntary VIH, inclusionary housing. So we'll talk about a little bit about those as well. But wanted to dive a little deeper into what we talk about when we say public versus private. So generally, when the city provides public land and public funding for housing development, or when a developer with private land wants to finance a project entirely with public dollars, those projects will be generally 100% affordable because they are public land, public funding, et cetera. On the other hand, when developers with private land would like to only take advantage of a partial subsidy in the form of a tax break or inclusionary housing, that's when you see projects that are only partially affordable on the housing lottery, et cetera. And then, of course, you have the private market as well. So most development in New York City does occur between the partial affordability and market rate categories. And that's because these are the areas that do not require direct funding from our government budget. These are mostly as of right projects that can occur. Okay, so we know there's been a lot of questions about area median income and how this metric is used in determining affordability. So hopefully the next few slides will shed some clarity here. So HPD uses the area median income as a point of reference to set income limits and requirements for new housing that are tailored to a variety of levels. So the area median income is determined each year at the federal government level for different regions across the United States, and is the basis for most nationwide, statewide, citywide housing programs. So the New York metro area goes in 2024. First I want to say the New York metro area does not just include New York City, it does include also a few counties outside of New York City. And the area median income for 2024 for a family of three is about 127,000. Now, as mentioned, these income limits are set at the federal level, and that is by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. So using the 100% AMI as the jumping off point, you can see on the graphic here on the right, the percentage of median income levels that we target with our different programs. So the lightest red being the lowest incomes, darker red considered lower income, up to 80% AMI, and then the darkest red considered middle or moderate incomes. But that income eligibility, you see that stacked kind of graphic, is because it's related to household size. So earlier we saw an example of a three-family household earning the median income of Community District 11 of 51,000. This family would fall under around like the lighter middle dark color, 60% AMI in the lower income section. To So that's just a general category of all our programs. If it was put into a graphic, we use this graphic in our community workshops, if you've been to some of them. So here's an additional snapshot of the 2024 income limits and what the maximum rent allowed would be. You can find a full table of this on our website. So, in 2024, three-person household, if we're building for 30% AMI, the, income limit would be 42,000, and the maximum for a two-bedroom rent would be 1,050. Whereas for 80% AMI, the maximum for the three-person household would be 112,000 with 2,800 rental price for a two-bedroom apartment. Okay, so now let's dive into the new construction financing programs that will also show some examples afterwards. So you can really, we'll do the text first and the boring part, and then we'll show the, examples of projects around Upper Manhattan. So these programs, as mentioned earlier, are direct public subsidies. They are projects that utilize these programs have direct funding through loans provided through the city's annual capital budget. So the first program is the Extremely Low and Low Income Affordability Program, known as ELA. And this funds the construction of low-income multifamily rental projects that will be affordable to households earning between 30 and 80% AMI. And as of 2020, Local Law 19 requires a minimum of 15% of units in affordable housing to be, affordable housing that's receiving city financial assistance to be reserved for formerly homeless individuals and families, or homeless individuals and families living in shelter to be formerly homeless when they go into HPD housing. The next category here, and that applies to each of these programs. So the new construction program funds infill rental housing with up to 45 units. So these are small scale across different, across different sites usually. To low, moderate, and middle income households. So this is a more wider category that's used to in more flexible scenarios. So it does go up to 165% of AMI in terms of the program that's available online, but generally HPD the bulk of the subsidy goes up to 120% of AMI. And then there is the mixed income program known as Mix and Match, and that is kind of what it sounds like, where you have 40 to 60% of units must be at the lower incomes, limited at 80% AMI, and then the remainder, whether that's 60 to 40%, can go up to 120% of AMI. So these are the multifamily rental, affordable rentals. Then you have special needs housing, is what we call it, also I think publicly we say supportive housing. So affordable rental apartments, are known as the SARA program, is a loan program to support the construction of affordable housing for seniors age 62 and older. And these, it can be affordable to households with one person who's 62 years and older, incomes up to 60% of AMI. In the case of this program, 30% are reserved for homeless individuals and families in shelter. And then for the supportive housing loan program, this is to support the construction of permanent supportive housing with on-site wraparound social services. And at least 60% of these units must be reserved for homeless individuals or families in shelter. This is a higher percentage, of course, because the purpose of supportive housing is to get folks into permanent housing options and out of shelter facilities. And finally, we do have a partnership program that we try our best to identify opportunities to utilize this as well. The Open Door program funds the construction of co-op and condo buildings to moderate and middle income households. In Manhattan, that would be likely a multifamily building, but in some outer borough cases, depending on the lot size, it could also fund 1 to 3 family homes. And these are affordable between 80 and 135% of AMI. Okay, I know we're making progress here. Hopefully everyone's hanging in there. Okay, now this is a bit of a dense slide. Tax incentives, you know, moving away from, we talked about those first programs are the direct subsidies that the city is putting in funding for. Tax incentives, on the other hand, are administered by HPD to further incentivize the inclusion of affordable housing in new construction. So this can get tricky because there's a lot of different exemptions, some that are used for public projects, some not. So I just want to highlight a few here, but this will be, these slides will be available to you. There will be also an appendix on these slides where you can learn more about each of these incentives if you'd like. But the first one to understand is the low income housing tax credits. This is colloquially known as LIHTC. These are tax credits that fund construction or rehabilitation of low income housing, which is a nationwide program. And they were administered through federal funding and allocated to states by volume. So what does that mean? Essentially means that projects are competing. The funding levels are capped and projects are competing for an award through LIHTC. And it's important to note that the vast majority of affordable housing is across the country is funded by this tax credit program, and it's allocated by population. So when folks are pushing you to take the census or something, it's kind of for programs like these where the federal government decides like how much funding affordable housing program will get for this district. And in terms of HPD specific tax incentives, I'd like to highlight Article 11, which is a tax exemption for HDFCs that are new construction or rehab, but also the 420C is a tax break for low-income housing that's developed with the tax credit I just talked about. So it's important to note that because later on when Melissa goes through the next section, you'll see that the way housing is financed is not through one program. There's like the program that's the direct subsidy, then you'll have the tax credit, and you'll potentially need a tax break on top of that to make the financing work. So just giving you a little preview there. Finally, the public has become very familiar with 421A, the tax incentive for privately financed buildings that expired in 2021, but you're still seeing some projects become completed, finishing construction. Some got an extension, but that has expired. And now the new exemption is called 485X. And 485X does have a bit of a more complex, it's a little more complex in the sense that there are different zones that qualify for different incentives, but generally for Upper Manhattan, it is, I believe, 25% of buildings that have over 100 units have to be at about 80% AMI average. But during the Q&A section, we can talk a little more in depth if you have questions about that program. Okay. I need a sip of water and then we'll carry on. Hopefully everyone else is hanging in there. All right, inclusionary housing. I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar or very familiar with. So there's mandatory inclusionary housing or MIH, and that was adopted in 2016. And with MIH, essentially 20 to 30% of floor area in new developments, enlargements, or conversions above 10 units must be permanently affordable for low and moderate income New Yorkers. So this is when there's a rezoning, there will be like an MIH area mapped. And then the developer has to choose one of these mandatory inclusionary options. Generally at HPD, we go for options 1 or 2. So yeah, this is either 25% at a 60% average weighted income band or 30% at 80% AMI income weighted average income band. And then there's voluntary inclusionary housing, which is when a development receives a density bonus. And this is only in certain areas that are voluntary designated. So this is not across the entire city. But one thing to note is that the VIH program is proposed to be replaced by what you have heard as Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, in the city of Yes for housing opportunity. So just a heads up there. Okay, now the fun part, examples. I talked a lot about, the specifics of each program, but I think it's important to ground them in some real examples, and we've tried to do the best in showing Upper Manhattan examples. So the first one I'll start off with is an Ella project. It is called the Eliza, and actually just had its ribbon cutting yesterday for the new public library branch. So a very exciting project for the Manhattan team here. This project is affordable to lower incomes between 30 and 60% AMI. It has 138 units, and like I mentioned, new public library branch. And we'll have several commercial and community spaces and a new universal pre-K. So, showing you kind of the example of different tiers of area median income. For a 3-person household of 40,000, you might have it's showing 1 bedroom. The building does have a mix of studio to 3 bedrooms, but in this case, we're just showing a 1-bedroom example, $500 up to $1,300 for 68% AMI. And that will be for incomes between 60 and 75,000. Those rents are, based on the previous year's income limits. The Eliza is already complete, so it'll be based on the previous year. Another project that I'm sure everyone's familiar with because you used it as a graphic cover for this finance training. Sendero Verde on East 112th Street here in East Harlem. It was a winner of an RFP in 2016. But this project used 2 programs, both Ella and Mix and Match. We have a very large project here with, I think, 700 units, I believe. The first phase opened in 2022. The second phase just opened in May. And in order to fund a project that, has a new 50,000 square foot school, was replacing Green Thumb Community Gardens, also has a new community center, and is now the largest fully affordable passive house building, which is this new highest energy efficiency standard. These are kind of a lot of components and a lot of land components to consider, height, density. This project used a combination of programs, and we'll talk about why projects do that later. And so you see a wide range of incomes going from as low as 15,000 to as high as 200,000. That would be for, a family of 5, potentially 5 or 6, I want to say. And then rents starting as low as 380, going to as high as 3,200. For the new construction program, NCP, we have Las Races, which maybe this community board is familiar with as well. Construction of 4 buildings across different sites, affordable up to 80% of AMI. It only will have 78 units total across the multiple lots. We are hoping it is currently in a financial closing phase, so hopefully you'll hear more about the construction phase of this project. Supportive housing example, we have Fortune Society, Castle Gardens 3 on East 123rd Street. So this is 82 units of supportive housing for formerly incarcerated and homeless individuals. They will only be paying up to 60% of AMI, and there will be on-site case management and supportive services. Victory Plaza is an example of a Sarah project in Central Harlem on 118th Street. It is a 94-unit senior housing building. In this case, the seniors are receiving Section 8 vouchers, so that limits the amount of income they'll pay up by, they would only have to pay 30% of the income. towards rent. And they're also income restricted on top of that, up to 60% of AMI. In this case, 41 units were reserved for seniors coming out of shelter facilities. Also have to show a tax incentive example. So these are, I know it's very common to see projects like these sometimes on Housing Connect. So I think it's important to highlight this as well. So this is a private building on East 125th that utilized the 421A program and inclusionary program. It's a 45-unit building where 34 units in that building were from middle income families between 80 and 130% AMI. And that translates to rents between $1,500 essentially for a studio up to about a little less than $3,400 for a 2-bedroom. And finally, we are lucky to have an option to show for homeownership as well in Central Harlem. And the lottery for this just ended last week. So there was 52 co-op units for sale for first-time middle-income home buyers, with co-ops sold between, what that translates to is co-ops being sold between $230,000 and $530,000. But it's a limited equity co-op, like many co-ops, which means that the resale value cannot be speculated on in the market to rise very quickly. So someone cannot buy this and flip it, for a profit. So with that said, I know that was a lot, but I'm going to pass it over to Melissa to talk about a little more in detail. We talked about programs, but Melissa will talk a little more about the specifics of how these, deals get put together, if you will. Is that one?
Yeah, this one works. Thank you so much, James, Agatha. I think that was a lot of information, and it was a lot of framework setting for this next part of the presentation. We're constantly mentioning how affordable housing is a balancing act. You might hear us in our responses regarding projects talking about financial feasibility. So I really hope that this part of the presentation can lay a framework for having those conversations and having those discussions. Some of this might be, especially for those of you out there that are really familiar with housing and real estate finance and things like that, this might be a refresher. But for those folks out there that are kind of newer to this, I hope that this is really helpful in defining the things that we're thinking about in the background when we're coming out to you with projects and saying, we can do this, we can't do this, or we need to have a conversation. We need to go back and think about it some more. So, and I also hope that, it opens the lines of communications. And bear with me, I am a planner. I'm not a real estate finance folk. We are the people from the agency who are chosen to speak on behalf of a lot of our technical folks. So we, just remember that.
You're doing great.
I appreciate it. But if you ask me what CEI is or something, I don't know what it is at this time.
We can do it all.
Oh, is it going? Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to start out by defining some terms, explaining what underwriting is, what a pro forma is. This is what we do to determine financial feasibility of a project. So a lot of you have heard underwriting pro formas. And basically, I'll start with a pro forma. What it is it's a budget or a financial statement that considers a proposed project's projected revenues minus expenses. So basically what that means is it's a series of tables with a lot of numbers in them. If you want to think about it, some are going to be in black, some are going to be in red. That represent the amount of money flowing out of a project. So the things that we're spending money on for a project, or its costs or expenses, and the amount of funding sources coming into a project to pay for those things. So your revenues. So this statement will contain uses. That's kind of the jargony term for it, which is project costs, or there will be sources, which is basically the funding sources, the money is coming in. Within those categories, you'll find certain sections for maintenance and operations, mortgages, loans, cash flows, tax credits, development budget, and more. Some of these things James already talked about. So underwriting is the process by which we come up with the pro forma. It's the process of evaluating a loan application to determine if it meets credit standards or any other special requirements. It determines whether a loan will be approved and what the terms and conditions will be. It's an iterative process. And again, as I stated, it's the process by which we produce a pro forma. I think the last important thing to note on this slide is that, and just to remind folks that when we're doing the underwriting process and when we're coming up with pro formas, part of that is that HPD usually provides subsidies through our loan programs. So that's where we get involved with underwriting and pro formas and why we're really concerned about it. We're a big part of the process for how projects get financed. You know, these subsidies are only one piece of the puzzle, in addition to funding from other city, state, federal, and private sources, such as banking or credit sources. All right. Oh, yeah, thanks. Now I can see my slides. Let's see. All right, so define the terms. Now we can actually look at like some of those tables I was talking about, because there's going to be a bunch of tables in our pro formas and our underwriting are come together into this one master table that's going to tell us if a project is financially feasible. At the end of the day, what we're looking for is we're looking for our uses and sources to balance out to zero. They don't always do that, and we have to get creative. But here you can see the table for uses. And you can see, as I mentioned, there's multiple categories for both uses and sources. So here on this slide, you'll see some examples of uses. Reminder that our uses are things that we are spending money on in a project. If we're thinking about creating a building from scratch, there are several broad categories we've got to spend money on, of which when we're talking about HPD projects, the second and third categories here are ones that are most critical to that balancing act that I'm talking about. So the uses details are as follows. We've got acquisition costs, which would be the cost of acquiring land on our publicly owned sites. HPD is conveying our sites for a nominal price, so very small price, like $1 per lot, to developers, which helps with the underwriting. It helps to make projects more financially feasible because it reduces costs. However, there are some projects where acquisition is needed, and that does drive up costs. So the next category is hard costs. So those are costs that are directly related to construction. They include labor, materials, utility connections, et cetera. Different project components can create higher hard costs. For example, larger, taller buildings can require more steel, which can be expensive. Site constraints such as being located near a viaduct, you know, that's a very special condition here in CB11. Or being infill can make construction timelines longer. It can make construction more difficult. It can require special equipment. And it can also drive up labor costs. Also having beautiful, high quality materials on the facade or on the inside, wonderful, but it does contribute to costs. So, you know, sometimes when we're talking about financial feasibility and there's these ask for things, we always love to consider them and, you know, we take it to the drawing board and see if it works. But sometimes, you know, it's the balancing act. And then we have soft costs. Again, this is another one of the categories that really does impact our projects a lot. So these are costs that are related to pre-development, items. So that includes architectural and design fees. I saw somebody make a little face over there. Legal fees, environmental consultant fees, to ensure that a project is well designed and built. Some important soft costs to highlight in terms of ones that can add to a project budget includes interest rates charged on loans. So that's another form of soft costs. Anything that's a fee that's not related to like materials and construction, that falls under the soft costs category. Unexpected fees in the pre-development process, such as a redesign, if that's warranted, that does cost extra money. So significantly changing floor plans can drive up costs. Sometimes that's because we have to change unit distribution, or if the building gets larger or smaller, that's a redesign, et cetera. In recent years, the interest rates on the loans have been one of the major things that we've been dealing with. I'm sure our finance folks could give us a whole presentation on that, but that is what I've been told. It's also really important to note that soft costs can include ongoing costs of operating and maintaining the project, such as ongoing maintenance plan for unit wear and tear, and the salary for the superintendent and the building utility repairs over time. One other thing, I think it's on the slide that I did not, oh, that's in the next slide, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So here, on the next slide, we're talking about sources. Oh, we're there. Thank you, James. So on this slide, you'll see an example of the sources sections of a pro forma. This is the monies we're bringing into the project to pay for those costs that I mentioned. We'd like to start by pointing out that financing is a balancing act, as I've said many times, and there are many different sources, city, state, federal, that go into a project. And any changes to the project could add additional costs to either ongoing maintenance or upfront construction costs. James mentioned a lot of those earlier in the presentation. And as a reminder, some of those sources come with certain programmatic requirements for affordability, number of units, unit sizes, et cetera. So we have two main buckets of sources, and these are related to the time frame by which the money comes in and what money is used to pay for. So the first is construction sources, which are the upfront subsidies, like the one our loan programs pay for, or LIHTC federal credit, tax credit to finance the construction of the proposed project. The second major bucket is permanent sources. So once the project is completed, there will be a conversion to permanent loan sources or funding sources, and they provide ongoing funding sources for maintenance and operations. These ensure that the project's long-term viability, and the permanent sources will include rental income. That's something really important to remember. So we're actually going to go over that in the next slide, and whether that comes from residential, commercial, or community facilities. In addition, many projects may receive grants that help plug any funding gaps that could occur. Examples include NYC's Building of Excellence for Resiliency and Energy Efficiency, which we're proud to say several HPD projects specifically in Manhattan received this past year, which was really exciting. I think they were all Upper Manhattan too. Two of them in East Harlem. That was very exciting. Yeah, bastion of sustainability and resiliency up here. We love it. And there is also Resolution A funding, which is known as discretionary funding from council members or from the borough president. We specifically like to highlight this here because it is a really important source of additional funding that we try to get for our projects. And when we're talking about ways that the community board can advocate for getting more funding into our projects, and I'm sure the council members up here and the borough president will love me saying this, but you can always advocate to them for projects that you believe really deserve the additional funding. So this is the last section that I'm going to talk about. This is cash flow. And this is where we're kind of talking about those rental incomes and those other incomes from other spaces, as well as how they balance against the ongoing maintenance and operations after the project is completed. So as I said, with the permanent sources, rental income is really important. And so there's going to be this portion of a pro forma that is cash flow. Cash flow shows a project income and operating expenses, as I said. And as you can see, in terms of income, we have rental income from residential units. But we also have community facility income and commercial spaces that can provide additional income on top of residential rental income. And that can support the operations of the building, or it could also help cross-subsidize affordable units. So this is the part that is really hard for me to explain, but I will do my best. So cash flow must cover debt service of the loan programs, and it must cover all other fees that are ongoing for operations and maintenance. What debt service is it's basically the interest that is charged on money that you're borrowing plus those loan payments. So think of it, it's kind of like your mortgage, right? But in the larger real estate development, housing development world, that's the term we use. Let's see. So here's where I'd like to highlight that unit sizes and AMI income limits of our rental units may affect financing of the final project. I know this is something we talk a lot about during our approvals process and when we come to the community boards. And we're always giving that answer of a balancing act. And it really is. For example, we absolutely understand and we love to provide larger family size units. This is something this community asks for a lot. This is something that neighboring communities ask for a lot. And, you know, a larger unit will provide more income per unit. You know, we're able to charge a little bit more rent because it is a larger unit. However, that will also mean there's less units available in that building overall, which could lead to less rental income for ongoing maintenance and operations. I say could because not always. Kind of is dependent on the project. Additionally, when you see higher AMIs, especially in programs like Mix and Match that we discussed earlier, these higher rents, they provide a revenue stream that helps cross-subsidize deeply affordable units. So a unit at 80% AMI will help subsidize a unit at 30% AMI. So, you know, this is something we talk about a lot. And I just, you know, if we have additional questions about that, we can talk about it. But the last thing I want to highlight is that with the cross subsidy idea, this is also where rental assistance programs can come into play and help with the financial feasibility of projects. They can provide additional funding streams because they're a source of guaranteed income for the project. So what that means is that within the project underwriting, you can underwrite a higher rent, but still charge a lesser rent and make those units affordable. Some of these rental assistance programs that we commonly see are Section 8 vouchers, which are administered through HUD and NYCHA. And then we also have New York's 1515 program. So with that said, that's all I'm going to say about performance and underwriting. We've got time for questions. I have a final slide to wrap it up. So to conclude, housing is a balancing act. City subsidy from all programs we discussed earlier will be the difference of the total development cost and all other sources of income. So city subsidy is part of the gap filler, but we sometimes still need other sources. Direct city subsidies are detailed by our programs term sheets, but they are limited by the yearly capital city budget and affected by the inflation for costs of construction. Their federally allocated funds are also limited and dependent on population size, as James plugged earlier. And then we have tax breaks, which can be more flexibly allocated and used to help make our projects financially feasible. The direct financing subsidies for affordable units offset the cost of providing them, but unit sizes and AMI tiers affect a project's long-term cash flow. Let's see. Costs of maintenance, operations, and providing affordable rent can also be offset by community facilities or commercial spaces, which bring additional revenue to subsidize the housing development. And with that, I know this is a lot to swallow. I am wrapping up now, but we hope it's been informative and we hope this sheds some light into how HPD finances projects. There's a lot more that can be said. Any one of these topics could be a presentation on their own or a series of presentations. So with that, we're going to open the floor. I hope there's plenty of time for questions. Thanks. I need a sip of water.
Cool.
Not for me. I'm gonna let them take it over. Thank you. All right.
Check. Thank you so much, HPD, for a great presentation. I saw folks taking pictures of the presentation as we went along. I was whispering in some ears. Makes sense. A lot of information. I'm glad you're that interested. HPD was kind enough to share a copy of this slide presentation, which we have made available on the community board website. So if you go to our meetings calendar and you go to the entry for tonight's event, the slide deck is already there. In that same place, you'll find the recording tomorrow, hopefully. It's the end of the year, so I'm a little busy, but I will try for tomorrow, end of the fiscal year. So this level of detail is difficult to allow sufficient time to absorb in a typical community board meeting because, you know, they're but so long and there's a number of agenda items on there. So that's why we wanted to have a standalone event just for this so that HPD can explain this to this level of detail, be able to have the time to address your questions in a way that can be digested and can be referenced in the future. You're not going to remember it all tonight. That's what the recording is for. So our hope is that if you get rusty on a detail, you can turn to that recording and find that, you know, useful and a good refresher for the public, for when you're providing your input to the community board, and for the community board when you're considering proposals that are, you know, coming from HPD or other agencies that we have to weigh in on as a board. And the last thing I'll say is, for now, for questions, we're going to try to alternate between, depending on the level of questions, between those that are in person and those that are online. The lead will assist. Folks that are online, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized. You'll be, we'll unmute you so you can pose your question. For those that are here in person, please wait for the microphone. Marlene will bring a microphone to you. This will help ensure that you can be heard by the folks that are participating online and that you can be heard by the recording so that your question, however poor it is or good it is, will live in infamy. So with that, if folks have any questions, I'll start in the room and then we'll go online. So if you could raise your hand and we'll bring up Mr. Bogursky, Marlene.
Yeah, that's on. Great. That was a lot. And I don't really have much background, but I'm numerate. So I have to say that that's a lot of data. And some of the assumptions that you underlie some of that is not in my knowledge. Like, for example, you kept talking affordable to up to. That language itself doesn't mean anything to me, but that's not my question. Like, I just want to tell you for the future that for people who have no background, you have to define some of the terms in your slides. Otherwise, it's really just data without explanation. That's just advice. But my question is this: you were talking about the fact that the larger size units might not bring enough extra revenue to offset the fact that they're taking up more space. Well, that's unless I don't understand, which of course I probably don't, how you set the rents for the different size units. If you set a specific revenue per square foot that you need to achieve in the building to make the pro forma work, then it shouldn't matter whether there are large apartments or small apartments because you're getting the same amount of dollars per square foot. So there may be some other formula involved in setting the rents for the different spaces, but that's a self-created problem. unless, again, there's another mechanism by which those numbers are set. So I guess that's my question. How do you set the rents for these different spaces? What is the basis by which you calculate those numbers?
Sure. It is a self-created problem. I think that we don't want to set like and again, I'm not a finance folk, so what I can say is that I'm thinking about the affordability distribution and then the unit size distribution. So, I think on a project by project basis, we want the flexibility to provide lower income and larger units or larger units at the lower incomes, if that's what's being asked for. So that's why it's a balancing act, is trying to leave the flexibility to respond to what the community is asking for, and tailoring those affordability levels and those unit sizes to what is being asked. James also wants to hop in here. He might have a more technical response.
No, yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Sorry, it's like weird back here. You can't hear yourself as much. To follow up on that and kind of, I think what you were getting into in terms of like the actual, how it pencils out in terms of swapping a 1 bedroom for a 3 bedroom. If you think about it, so let's say a 1 bedroom, this is not like based on the real, or maybe we can go to one of the slides actually that we had earlier that showed here we go. So let's say at 50%, a 1 bedroom is 1,100 at 50% of the area median income. If that is now changed to a 3 bedroom, you're taking up what would have been 3 apartments, but you're likely not going to be charging 3 times. You won't be charging 3 times 1,100. So the issue,
My question is, why not?
Well, I'm just saying that that could be the correct option, but there's limited space in the building, right? If there's only up to a certain height allowed in the zoning district, it gets into the other components of planning, which we try to consider. Sometimes a building will expand if the demand is for both, both more deeply affordable, more family size units. We might have to make a building larger, but that's why Melissa was saying it's very project specific. But at its essence, you're taking away, right? Like if you're going from 1 bedroom to 3 bedroom, you're taking away 3 rooms to put, to make a larger apartment, which definitely needed in many New York City communities, but you won't be, the income that you're getting won't be 3 of those apartments.
Well, again, I don't mean to take up all the time with this, but that's where I guess I'm struggling, because first of all, it's not 3 to 1 usually, because a 3-bedroom apartment would have only 1 kitchen, or 1 bedroom apartment has a kitchen. So it's not going to be exactly the scale. But the reality is, the limited time I've been on the community board, it seems as one of the things that people are most concerned about is there's not enough apartments for families. And there's a lot of the affordable projects that I've seen have studios, lots of studios. Obviously, there's a math issue here, right? That is seen as being more profitable. I know it's not about profit, but just to use that as a term, profitable to have smaller apartments, which have disproportionately higher rents per square foot, right? That's why we have studios. I'm just saying, if you change the formula by which you calculate the rents, you wouldn't have that obstacle anymore. So, but that just seems to me, again, that's a math question.
You would have less units in the building.
Yes, you'd have fewer units, absolutely.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You have as much revenue, so it wouldn't affect.
Sure, but I think part of it is that's the other balancing part about city housing policy, I think, is that we also need, as we mentioned, there's a housing crisis, so we're trying to build more units, and it does come down to, what the community board comes to us with and the council member.
Right. That's a different limiting factor. I'm saying that the dollars.
Yeah, and what James is alluding to a little bit here too is housing is am I on? It is that weird thing. Okay. Housing is a balancing act in terms of finance, but it's also a balancing act in terms of like addressing the housing crisis, right? Like we think of what the community needs, and then we're also trying to address the housing crisis in the city as a whole. So we're balancing those things. However, our responses are not to say that we will not and do not want to provide family size units. Oh, we definitely hear that. And, this is just an explanation of the forces that are at play when we're trying to figure out how many family size units to include into a project. But we hear that maybe there's another way to think about it. We can talk to our finance folks about it. They might have some great explanation that's way up here. So thank you for the feedback.
We have a question online from Christina Johnson. Christina, you can unmute and pose your questions.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry. I'm in the supermarket, so please excuse the background noise. However, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative but confusing because I really don't know much about what you were saying. However, my one question is there some place that I can go to, or is there more information on what a 1550 is? That kind of stood out to me.
We heard that correctly. The question is about the 1515 program. Is that correct?
Yes, I was asking about the 1550. Where can I get information on what that is? So at least I can have some idea of what you were speaking of.
Yeah, it's definitely in the HPD website. But the 1515 rental assistance program, and I might pass the mic to Agatha in a second. She has a little more experience working with it, but it's a rental assistance program where supportive housing tenants pay 30% of their income towards rent. It's both like funding, it's funding to help the project be built, but also for rental assistance so that folks can, eligible groups can be housed in suburban and supportive housing. And the 1515 program funds wraparound social services. So it's a subsidy that helps subsidize staff, social services, security, et cetera, for permanent supportive housing. But because it's an assistance program, it can be paired with other housing. And so, we'll see it sometimes in other projects combined with an other program. Yep. I don't know if either of you want to say anything else about it.
I'd just also say, since it is a supportive housing program, it's meant to target individuals who have serious mental health issues, substance abuse issues, or other disabling medical conditions. And those wraparound services help those people transition to permanent homes within the affordable housing developments.
Thank you.
Definitely find that info on HPD's website.
Great. Thank you again so much for your presentation. And I'm an architect, and that's why I laugh at your slide deck there, but I could never do as great as you did explaining the complexities of the financing. So thank you so much for that. I'm trying to decide which one of my questions is the most important. But I guess, one example that I have heard of is like the abuse of housing tax credits, like the J51 tax credit, for example. How might we continue to prevent, people receiving tax credits for something and then, in the end, not providing what it is they're supposed to be providing? Or, for example, like I think, and just really quick, I think to all of this discussion, an important element that's missing is design. It is hard to design a building that has, the hallways and the code requirements and, accessibility and the elevator and egress and, good design in order to make all of this work too. And it's not just the financing, but I guess if we could start with the tax credit abuse prevention, and then how do we handle like units being converted away from like Section 8 vouchers? Like there's, for example, the Heritage Building has Section 8 vouchers, and they're slowly converting those to market rate units. Like, how do we do anything about that?
So those are really good and tough questions. I'm going to address the design thing real quick. You know, we could do a whole separate presentation about site constraints and how that impacts programming and financing. You know, of our projects, we have done that for CB7 before, many years ago. So, you know, if that's something that's of interest, maybe sometime down the road, we could offer that to you as well. I don't know if it would be as in-depth as you could talk about, but we've done that before. And that is a little bit more down our planner school pedantic route. All right, so as in terms of enforcement of tax credits and programs, anything, and you know, I'd have to get back to you with a very specific answer on this, but you know, if it's something that HPD is administrating, we do have several enforcement teams within the agency. And I think we're actually forming new ones. Is the word that I might have heard today. So I can definitely get back to you with the different enforcement like agencies and mechanisms that, or not agencies, but teams and mechanisms that we have on that. I mean, a very simple answer, and this is maybe more of my citizen hat and not my HPD's hat, is, you know, if you hear of something, you know, you report it to us. You can either talk to Angel about calling me, which I owe him answers on a couple of things. And we can try to find you know, a way to get people out to the building and make sure that they're fulfilling the requirements. The Section 8 question, that is admittedly over my head, and I'd have to get back to you. You know, it would have to do with HUD, right? And that is more of our programs folks. So I can get back to you on that one too.
The mic. Wait, no. Chivalry's not there.
So is everything new to me? So I wanted some basic information like, do I have to live in the neighborhood to apply? Where do I go if I, you know, is there an office where I can go show my income tax or something and see what's available? And I see that you have units for rent, but also you sell some units, right? There's some like I could buy also, right? So how?
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't focus today's conversation on this, but so, you know, it is HPD administers the Housing Connect 2.0. It is known as, sometimes known as the Housing Lottery as well. So it is, if you, I don't, the website housingconnect.hpd.gov. We can pull it up and share it with you. But yeah, through that, you know, you could, it's actually a pretty simple application. You can just put in your income and the people in your household, and you can immediately see, and the borough, and you can immediately see all the options that you'd like, you know, to apply to. But later on in the process, if you are selected, then you have to work to provide all your tax information and stuff. So upfront, you don't need to do that. You just put in your information, but then when they need to do the check, then they will reach out. But that's if you get selected from the lottery. Got it. But in terms of the community preference, you're not, it's eligible to all New Yorkers, but there is a preference if you live in the community district of 20% until 2026, and then that will drop to 15%. But basically, you get a little bit of a preference for living in the district. So it's called Housing Connect. Yeah.
And just to add on, HPD also has a housing ambassadors program, and you're able to go online on HPD's website and find a housing ambassador in your neighborhood, and they can help you connect to those units on Housing Connect.
Or you can talk to your community board about housing ambassadors. They should be maintaining a list, not to put the community board on the spot, but that's part of the housing ambassadors program is there are housing ambassadors within the neighborhood and, they partner with the community boards in order to be able to reach folks. Yeah, so those folks in the Housing Ambassadors Program can help you get your information together so that, when if you qualify for a unit, they can help you make sure you're prepared to successfully, get into that unit.
First and foremost, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. I speak on behalf of the board as well as to all our constituents. And I do have a question, but an ask would be yes, to continue to build bridges with us so we can provide presentations and information to our constituents so they can understand that HPD is here to work with the community and to serve those constituents. Which brings me to the next question, right? One of the efforts that I've seen in the last 5 years, particularly the last 2, is the pre-ULIP process, where HPD took an initiative to come out to community boards well ahead of the ULIP process, which sometimes felt overwhelming. In reality, was extremely stressful, right? With trying to cover some of these nuances. So I did hear the part, and this is where the question is to further assist HPD in their process, as well as our practice of advising and advocating for our district. What would you recommend in ways that CB11 and or any community board can help HPD to bring these projects to fruition, and more importantly, to convey the appropriate message to our constituents, where HPD is not in the business of building market rate housing, which tends to be a lot of the challenges I deal with as a chair in educating our members.
So I'll start with the last part. We are not in the business of building market rate housing. That would, in my opinion, my personal opinion, that is not the best use of our limited resources. I think there are a lot of things. I'll start with like very easy things. I think the community boards that are able to effectively communicate their needs, specifically, the income levels that they're looking for is really helpful, because we go back to our internal parties, we go back to our finance folks, and we say, this is what the community is asking for. We need to do our research, and we need to make sure that we are building housing that is affordable to this neighborhood. Now, part of that is that we are putting subsidy into these projects, right? And we're trying to make this balancing act happen. And we do have really limited resources sometimes. So, and I'm going to admit, some folks might not want to talk about the fact that we do have limited resources, but when it comes to time for budget hearings and things like that, making housing a priority, especially in your district statement of needs, or any time that your council members coming to you or any elected officials coming to you and asking, what are some of the priority items we need to budget for affordable housing? So whether that's HPD or even our friends over at NYCHA, because we're not the only housing agency here in New York City. I think advocating for funding for those folks, and on the city level, it's HPD, but on the state level and federal level, it's NYCHA. And then also, just education about what the reality of these housing units are. We've talked about several different programs that we have, and I think that having an honest conversation about what those programs really mean, looking at projects that have already been built and kind of learning from them and seeing what's worked for those communities and saying we want something like this is really helpful. So yeah, it's ongoing education. And it's, you know, opening that dialogue and letting us hear. We keep our ears open. Is there anything else specific you were looking for if in terms of, is that helpful? Right.
Okay. Let's see if I understood. You said the HPD provided loan plus tax exemption for anybody who want a building for affordable housing, right? Do you guys follow up if there's the number exactly of units, if the units be occupied, and who does the interview for those lotteries? When do you be calling? Who does the interview with people?
Sure. So we certainly follow up. When we get approvals, we then go through a closing process, and part of that is the development team has to submit a full design package that gets approved by the Department of Buildings. And that package they submit is what they're supposed to be building. So they submit that. It has to be within the approvals that they received, you know, that we brought, the project we brought through. And then once a project is constructed, we do have inspectors who come out and they look and they see to make sure that what is built has been built. So it's we have HPD inspectors, DOB has their own inspectors. Everything has to be further approvals from the agencies before the projects can get their final sign-offs and it can be occupied. As far as who does the actual interviews for the lottery, I'm not actually sure about that. I feel like these two are more the specialty on the marketing side. I feel like Acta knows this a lot.
Yeah, so HPD has a vetted list of marketing agents that developers can choose from to work with. And then those marketing agents are the ones that do the specific interviews for the specific developments. But that list is a vetted list that HPD has, and it developer has to pick from that list. And if for some reason someone feels that they have been unfairly treated against or not, the process is not going smoothly, they can report that to HPD and file an appeal to access or to try to re-access that unit.
If we could contact somebody from HPG. Because when they have those new developers, they're not going to house connection until there is nothing available.
So all of HPD's units do go on Housing Connect.
After there is nothing available. Yes, I know because I applied for HPG for affordable housing for 30 years. That's my brother and I, it has to be 2-bedroom. They never call me. When they call me, they offer me a studio.
So I think that goes to your specific application process. So depending on your household size, that's how many the unit size you can qualify for.
All that.
So 2-person household, I think most likely is not qualifying for a 2-bedroom unit.
For one, they only call for a studio. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you.
First off, I just want to thank y'all for the presentation. Super informative, really helpful. And I definitely want to follow up and ask y'all more questions later. And this might be a bit in the weeds, but I wanted to talk about tax incentives. So do you have a sense of how, or is it 485X, how it interacts with the universal affordability preference compared to like 421A, and just maybe like a quick and dirty, like 2 bullet points, what does that kind of look like?
This is the last thing I added to my talking points. So I was ready for this question. So 485X created sort of these various categories in order for it to comply with, not comply, but play well with the universal affordability preference. And so basically there's 3 different options and different zones, but I'll focus on the one that like will be pertinent for Upper Manhattan, which is option A of the tax break, which is for large rental projects that will have over 100 units. They would be so this is large rental projects. It was in any zone because the other zones specify like below 96th Street and certain districts in Brooklyn and Queens. So really, this is the only option that applies for Upper Manhattan. And it would be 25% of the units must be affordable housing units at an average of 80% AMI. There cannot be more than with more than 3 AMI income bands allowed, the highest band capped at 100%. So what you remember from 421 is it went a little higher, up to 130% AMI. You would see a lot of those units in the housing lottery. Again, this is an as of right tax exemption. So a private developer can approach the city to take advantage of this tax exemption. So this is the replacement to 421A. And how it plays with UAP essentially is that the universal affordability preference would provide a bonus of density for about, I think it's 20% of the building. There'll be a 20% bonus if they build that extra bonus as affordable. So I just said the tax rate is for 25% of the building, the bonus is for 20%. Like extra density. So basically it's a swap of like extra density for affordability. UAP, however, requires that weighted average. If you want that density, then you have to go even lower to 60% AMI weighted average. So you have 2 options basically as a developer. Let's say you come to East Harlem, you buy a lot, you want to build. You can use 485X alone, no density bonus. You'd have to average the units at 80% AMI for 25% of the affordable housing units. Sorry, 25% of the units in the building. Or you get the bonus, and then you have to go deeper to 60% AMI, the bonus density. It incentivizes the deeper levels of affordability, but then the building gets a little larger, so the developer has a little more, income coming in, as we were talking about the balancing act of income. And, if you have to go deeper affordable, you have to, on the other hand, the developer, has to find an income source. But once again, that's for private developers as of right tax break. So just clarifying that. Yeah. But if also it's on the website, you can learn more about all the other zones that don't apply to Upper Manhattan, but there's a couple of, it gets very detailed.
Hi, my name is Beverly, and thanks, board member, and thanks for the presentation. A lot of good information, a lot to digest. I'll be listening to this again, falling asleep, probably listening to it so I can stick in. Most of the things that you talked about were for new construction. I didn't hear anything about preservation and how the funding for that works out. So I'd like some information on that. And can you explain?
Wants to come back, is what you're saying.
Yes, because there's a lot of buildings here that we like to preserve. There's a lot of warehousing of units that needs to be done. So I'm very much interested in how that's funded. Can you explain the difference between, or what's the process between construction loans to permanent loans?
Maybe you could take that.
Right. So you're asking literally the conversion process. So as we stated, construction loans are these loans for the upfront construction to build the building. They typically have a little bit higher interest rates. You do not want to be having a long construction period because of this. You want to, get your construction done. And then typically how it works, and this is more of an industry standard that I'm talking about right now. Typically how it works is after the building is completed to a certain degree. So it's almost finished. Then lenders come in with the permanent loans that will cover, the completion of the building and then the operation and maintenance of the building in the long term. And that has better terms. So you complete the construction and then you go in for permanent financing to help pay off that construction loan and then to continue operating and maintaining your building. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is that just for private, or I mean, you said, commercial loan, would that be something that you would work with HPD? That they would go from construction loan to permanent loan?
Yeah, so we provide subsidy for both. And then you can also have private lenders. So it is a stacking of different loan sources depending on the project.
Yeah, just to build on that, if you see on this screen, we have the example template, and this is when we send over or I guess Angel said the deck is already sent over. You can click on the link. There'll be this is like a generic template, but as you can see, there's like multiple. It's listed in a very generic way. It's like first mortgage, second mortgage, third mortgage, fourth mortgage. These are different sources, and one of those will be, or two of those will be from the city, for example. But then another one might be the federal tax credit. Another one might be a private loan. Another one might be the Reso A funding that Community Board 11 fought so hard to get. So those are the different, how that sort of. But does that make a little more sense of how they're stacked? Like,
Yes. Yeah, I'm just.
Sorry, I'll also add, maybe just reading between the lines a little bit there. The reason why there's different loans is I kind of mentioned the construction loans. Typically, the terms on those aren't as favorable. And it's because construction is risky. You want to get a building done. So it takes those factors into consideration with the terms of the loan. So once again, you want to get construction done and incentivizes you to get the construction done, and then the permanent loan financing comes into play.
But the programs that you specified, you don't have to go through construction loan to permanent loan because you're financing.
We still do conversions, but that's one of those things where it's again over my head. And I'm not sure the exact details of it in our requirements. So that's why I was saying the way I was talking about it is more just like industry standard for real estate rather than HPD specific. Which is kind of funny that I know one and not the other, but.
Well, I know we're out of time, and I think there are plenty of questions. And I think that what we can do is collect the questions that have yet to be answered or more data-driven questions so that we can send them to you all for your input. But thank you so much. I have one last question before we end, and I think it's important as it relates to community boards. I sit on both sides of the table, so I get, I hear from community board members, like not just our community board, but all community boards about fear of the sort of developer as being sort of the greedy, behind the curtains people. And then the developers, thinking that, oh, the community boards are just NIMBY, they don't want any development. They can't, listen to what we're trying to do. And, obviously the truth is in the middle. But, I think one of the important parts of the pro forma that we didn't necessarily talk about was the developer fee.
Yes.
Right. And it's, I think it's an important part of making the project work, and it's not just about the developer making money. And I hope that if you could just spend a few minutes talking about that.
Sure, we absolutely can. And I did gloss over it because I was focusing on those hard costs and the soft costs, but there is the developer fee. So developer fee is a standard part of our underwriting. It is a guaranteed source of income for the developer on the project. Our developer fees are much lower than industry standard, but they are something that helps people keep the lights on. We have to, people aren't going to do this for free and they're not going to lose money on it. They put in a lot of time and work. And sometimes our developers are small community-based developers. We want to keep them operating. And we hope that there's a fine balance in the developer fee. That is, again, it's much less than industry standard on HPD projects. And keeping those lights on. The other thing I'll add about developer fees is that this part of the underwriting isn't something that will impact the affordability levels. So it's not something that we will let impact those things.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, HPD, for fielding the questions. For those questions that we didn't get to, rest assured, we're collecting them all. And we will reach out to HPD to try to get some responses for you. Any remaining questions can be sent to me, Angel Mesquina, the community board, via email at amescain@cb11m.org. And if you didn't get that, it's on the website all over the place. So I want to thank HPD again and all of you for attending. For those of you that are here, for those of you that are online, yes, this was dense. Yes, it's not the most exciting thing, but it's very important. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that a lot of the stuff that was spoken about this evening looks the way it looks now as a result of community input in the past. So the idea of 30% of AMI, even as a concept, I started working here 15 years ago, impossible. The idea of affordable housing at 165% of AMI we were seeing in this district, they wouldn't even walk in the room and talk about that anymore, right? And it's because of input from the community over time that eventually reached a receptive ear, and a strong enough case was made for enough of an understanding on the receiving end to tailor the way that the city finances affordable housing, the way that the city, determines its goals in terms of, the number of units, the types of units, size of units for communities like this, for different income levels like we have in our community. We're not just this AMI or that AMI, we're cross-section. However, the need that, as we've stated time and again, is highest at the lowest incomes. And the city has made a lot of progress in that regard. All the progress, certainly not, but a lot of progress. And that needs to be acknowledged, not just to pat HPD on the back, yes, but also to pat ourselves on the back, because we've been hearing our community and we've been advocating vociferously for our community, and the results are there. The Sendero Verde project that was referenced earlier, it's over 700 units. That was a vacant lot with a couple of community gardens and a couple of lots full of weeds. And now there are 700 households there, and a school, and a community center, and 4 community gardens, and public open space. And Las Raíces, which had they showed the one taller building, but there's also some smaller ones that were seen as undevelopable. And now that's going to house our neighbors. Now, that's not to say that you snap your fingers and it's going to be easy for anyone to access all of those. Certainly not. There's a lot of demand. The level of demand is nearly impossible. So the frustration on the part of the applicant makes sense. However, the only way you can do anything about that is to produce, and have priorities with what you're producing. So that's our push at CB11. And I'm glad that HPD has been receptive. It's an ongoing conversation always. Administrations changed, staff changed. Like, this was not the Manhattan Planning Group when I started, but it is now, right? This is a good group, not just because they're here, right? You can talk to these folks. I can talk to them. That they're here is a really good thing. Not every agency shows up. I can't get NYCHA to do this, right? And even though we have so much NYCHA, but we do have HPD here talking about this very specific thing. We should and we will try to have a follow-up conversation in a similar format on specifically preservation and how we do that. To Beverly's point, we have a lot of opportunities to preserve housing. a lot of opportunities to develop affordable homeownership for our neighbors, and that takes a lot of conversation. So I hope that this is a good first step to continue these kinds of conversations in the hopes of having the results that we've had in the past and that we need towards the future to serve the needs of our district. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thanks again, HPD, for being here. And